the actual, say, language proficiency from a speaking or writing point of view? Or is the construct contamination too great to the extent that you can't really separate them out? So again, this is something that you have to think about, and maybe actually only awards a score for the productive element itself, although through interweaving descriptors related to the input material. So yeah, there's no magic bullet with all of this. It's only really decisions and justifications that we can do. Score uses expectations. Yeah, for example, higher education admissions often expect to see assessment scores reported as 4 skills. Yeah, that's absolutely crucial. That's not going away anywhere anytime soon. So especially for high stakes assessment, we're still going to have to give these 4 scores. So we would need to make decisions about where, say, a mediation or an integrated skills task would actually fall within those. So as I said, maybe we would only use it to as part of the writing assessment, and it would only contribute to a writing assessment score. And then for reading, you would also have a more traditional reading assessment. So yeah, I think that's enough for now. Okay, so yeah, part 2, we're thinking a little bit more about the practical elements of that. So I think we've come around to this a little bit. We've covered a lot of these areas. So we've thought about task types. We've thought about issues related to the input and the output, and whether or not we are working as kind of individuals or whether in groups. And then, of course, what we haven't really talked about so far is the kind of practicalities, the constraints. We talked a little bit about timing and also resources as well. So here are some known issues. Now, I want to sort of turn our attention to slightly more concrete examples. And hopefully sort of use these concrete examples to try and tease out some lessons a little bit. So these are kind of known issues, some of which are from the literature. However, there's some areas which perhaps are under-researched in the literature at the moment. So I think absolutely crucial with respect to integrated skills tasks, which speaks a lot to the test takers and knowing what they need to be doing during the activity, is writing purpose and genre. So in other words, from the test taker's point of view, who are they writing for specifically or speaking for? So let's assume that we've got some kind of reading into writing activity and the students are being asked to write something. It can be very challenging if they don't know who they're writing for. Now, with a traditional essay, that's easier because, of course, they're writing for their tutor. But with something like an integrated reading into writing task, are they still writing for their tutor? Are they writing for their classmates? Are they writing for somebody else? And if they're transforming the language in some way, what are the kind of genre requirements? What are they transforming from and to? And then this is a significant issue that I don't think has been really researched enough in integrated skills tasks at the moment. But the nature of the reading. So to what extent do these kind of tasks activate sort of careful local reading, or do they still really emphasize this kind of search reading, this kind of higher level reading that we may not prioritize or may not be, say, entirely domain relevant? So the nature of the reading, I think, is a little bit under-researched still, but I'd like to see a bit more of. And again, who is the reader and who is the test taker writing for? Again, we mentioned that I don't think there's been a huge amount of research on the impact of different audiences or different audience requirements on performance of test takers in these kinds of tasks. And then one major thing we haven't really talked about at the moment is something that the CFR talks about quite a lot, which is synthesis. So if, for example, students are given multiple sources, whether multiple written sources or maybe one spoken source and one written source, how are they expected to combine those and in what ways? And how are they expected to go about doing that? And again, I think this is one of the reasons why test takers feel like they need more time in this activity. It's not only because they're maybe uncertain about the task requirements, but they actually don't necessarily know about what the appropriate strategies are for going about completing that task in the first place. So this all speaks to the importance of understanding and test taker familiarity with task types. And then, of course, the degree of alignment versus verbatim text use is really, really important as well. And then, right, so when it comes to assessments, I'm just going to put these up on screen. They're coming out about a different order. So we've spoken a little bit about assessments. So again, when it comes to scoring these, I mean, at the moment, it's almost certainly the case that the majority of them are human assessed. But is the fact that we have significant input material potentially a source of strength for these tasks? If, for example, we're thinking about AI and automating assessments around these kinds of tasks. When we have more traditional essay style tasks, we could get a very, very wide range of possible responses to the tasks. And the sheer range of responses can be a challenge for automated assessment because it can be very, very difficult. We would need very, very large number of sources to train a model in order to automate assessment. Whereas actually with an integrated skills task, if we have a lot more input material and the output is a lot more constrained in terms of what we expect test takers to produce, potentially that's a strength of automated assessment. I've actually done a little bit of research on this on one of our tasks, actually, and there's some quite promising findings around this that suggest that integrated skills tasks are actually amenable to automated assessment. But let's assume we're sticking with human scales for now. Again, do we want them to be holistic? Are we giving a single score or are we giving multiple scores for, say, task completion, input use, grammar, vocabulary? Are we still using these traditional metrics of performance, or do we need something entirely new? And again, how many levels? Are we aligning these levels to the CFR based on can-do statements from some of these lower level categories? How do we deal with copying? Is that something we could automate, actually? What's the proportion of the inputs that is simply verbatim from the actual input sources? And therefore, can we use that to actually almost like a kind of decision tree based approach for a computer based scoring model for this kind of task? And if we are working with assessors, with human assessors, how do we make life easier for assessors? Because if you're an assessor and you're working with assessing, say, a piece of writing or a piece of speech that is an integrated skills task, not only are you expected to mediate between the response and the task, you've got to mediate between the response, the task, and the input. And it's almost like you have to keep these multiple things in your memory, your working memory, as you try and assess. And that's in addition to the scoring rubric as well. So it's almost like a four-way interaction going on here. So not only are these cognitively demanding for test takers, they are cognitively demanding for assessors as well. And they take longer to score each individual sample than, say, a traditional presentation or a traditional essay. So how do we make life easier for assessors? So here's a real-world example for how we try to deal with this. So this is something that actually happened to me. So working at OUP, this was the mandate that I was given. We had to change an existing test to make it suitable for C1 level for university entrance and also for professional purposes. It had to be a written output. It had to take account of the CFR companion volume and mediation in particular. But you must do a task within 20 minutes only and must not incur any development costs whatsoever. So basically that meant I wasn't able to introduce a kind of listening and reading into writing. It had to be reading into writing. So this is a real world situation that you're quite likely to find yourself in. So 20 minutes, as we've heard from one of our participants today, they had 90 minutes to do an integrated skills task. I've only got 20 minutes to deal with this. So, of course, what we did look at was the CFR descriptors. So we looked at these metrics that I mentioned earlier, these can-do statements, and tried to pick out ones that we thought were particularly useful for distinguishing, say, B2 from C1. And there were some interesting findings from this activity. So what we did was pick out some verbs and see how many times each of the verbs appeared at different CFR levels for the mediation descriptors. And so you can see some quite interesting things going on here. So, for example, convey and summarize stretch right across the kind of B1, C2 ranges. Whereas the introduction of the plus levels for the CFR actually resulted in those words in the middle there, make explicit, simplify, clarify, compare, contrast, synthesize, make and support inferences, only appearing at B2 plus and not appearing anywhere else. That's a direct artifact of the updating of the CFR. But then, of course, we've got things like adapt, interpret, facilitate understanding, and reorganize, which are much more prevalent at C1 and C2 than any other levels. So this was quite useful for us in thinking about, well, what should we be doing as well? So here is a couple of actual mediation descriptors. So what we've got here is a little bit of coloration. So the orange is kind of the verbs. The blue is kind of the texts themselves that the test takers might be expected to deal with. The green is kind of the genre or the field of interest, particularly. And then the purple relates to the style a little bit more. So as you can see, texts which can include evaluative aspects, texts which are nuanced, texts which are longer, which are complex, texts which have particular style or a particular register. There's a list of prospective genres there that you could extract from, whether they're novels, editorials, reviews, academic. And then what you expected to do. So summarize was quite a significant word there. So that's really what we looked at. And then from that, we came up with the following, I suppose, construct definition, really, in which we were considering both the reading and the writing components. And then also, I think if you're talking about defining your integrated construct, you have to really, really think about the strategies and the monitoring and revising elements of this as well. So it's not the case that in the task like this, people read and then they write. It's incredibly recursive. People read, they write a bit, they read a bit, they write a bit, they read a bit, they write a bit. And then maybe at the end, they read their entire response carefully. And then maybe they also go back and reread aspects of the input text as well. So what we found with a task like this is that the nature of reading seems to change throughout the task, and also the nature of writing changes quite substantively throughout the task as we go. So here's a little bit of text. So I'm not going to dwell on this. I just think it's important that you're aware of this. So if you want to have a look at the slides afterwards, I'm certainly happy to share them. So here are some useful references. So in particular, I want to draw attention to one thing. So Cyril Weir was particularly adamant in a recent review of IELTS and I think academic texts in general, that the one major element of tests for academic purposes, especially integrated reading into writing tasks, that seems to be missing is the notion of intertextual reading, actually. So reading and working with more than one text input. So that's something that we absolutely wanted to try and integrate into this task as well. And then Gusheng Yu at Bristol has made some really, really good points around the nature of input text as well. So it's not just around, giving people input. The input has to be suitable for use in an integrated or mediated task. So Yu talks about what he calls the summarizability of the task, actually. So input materials have to be summarizable. It's no good, for example, giving test takers a text which is composed entirely of detailed information or supporting information. There has to be some way that you can extrapolate main versus supporting information in a text if it is to be summarizable. So that's something to be extremely mindful of, is the nature of the input material as well. So this is actually it. This is what the task looks like. This is what we came up with. So this is publicly available. So what I'm presenting to you is, I think, freely available either in some sample tests or for the test specifications that we have online. I've got a QR code at the end that you can actually scan, or if you even just Google it, you'll be able to find it, to be honest. So I just want to draw your attention to some very specific features of task design that we came across that were really, really important. So as I said, it was 20 minutes, and 20 minutes includes both the reading and the writing. So what we don't do is tell test takers specifically how much time they should spend reading versus how much time they should spend writing. Because what we found when it came to piloting was that it wasn't really possible to differentiate between those two stages. So people don't specifically have a kind of reading and a writing stage. What you do find is people spend quite a bit of time at the beginning of the task reading, but once they've finished the initial read, then the behavior changes radically, and then they start going back and forth to the text and their own response regularly. Like within every 10 seconds, they're going back and forth to the input text to their own response. In many cases, test takers did not read both texts before they started writing. They may have even read a little bit of text one, and some people do some very interesting strategic approaches to this. So start reading text one, start writing their summary, and then go back to text one, write a little more summary, go back to text one, write a little more summary, then go to text two, write a little more summary, go back to text two, write a little more summary, and then they say, okay, I've done that. Then they look at what they've written, and then they start reorganizing and working with what they've written entirely. Whereas other test takers read everything very carefully, then were very selective about what they picked out, then started writing, and then went back to the texts, and then started rewriting. So all sorts of strategic approaches were coming out of this. So it has to have a named area. So all the tasks are in a specific area. In this case, it's psychology, but it could be archaeology, it could be geography, it could be weather, it could be fashion, anything you like. And then what we also specified is that in relation to the summary, there had to be one paragraph and they had to use full sentences. And again, this is very important because what we found when we started piloting is that some people would write lots and lots of bullet points, for example, which effectively is potentially quite a good strategy, but is quite limited in terms of the nature of the output, in terms of your ability to score it from a grammatical or even a kind of synthesis or a kind of grammatical complexity point of view. And then, of course, we had very specifically to identify the main ideas that you got out of this. And then, whereas a lot of tasks have a minimum word count, write at least 150 words, to make sure that they were actually summarizing and being very selective about what they were picking out, we introduced a maximum word count. So we do have penalties for people who go above 105 words. So we allow 5 words of latitude, but anything above 105 words is penalized for task fulfillment. And then we also have 2 extracts underneath. First one is always an extract from a textbook, and interestingly, the next one is an extract from a transcript. So the reason we chose to do that, although it's a little unusual, is this was a very, very good way of introducing spoken language artifacts into the second text. And this makes it much more challenging for test takers to actually copy the input. So there has to be some kind of genre transformation in relation to text too. A secondary reason why we introduced that is we've also found that, interestingly, transcripts are an increasingly popular text that we're observing in higher education. So not only are lectures taking place online, we're finding that lectures are being recorded and being transcribed, and often the transcripts are being made available to students as well. So I actually recently did an online master's degree. I've just finished it actually, and in my own experience, all my lectures were transcribed and publicly available, and so we're able to work with those. We do also have a glossary of main terms as well. And when it comes to the audience for this, so what we chose to do is write a summary of the main ideas to share with your class. So it's actually there. I forgot to highlight it, but it's at the end of that first paragraph there. So what we chose to do was to maintain the audience as essentially the test taker. So the test taker is writing for somebody like themselves. So they're not trying to imagine somebody different or somebody external to their experience. So just to try and claw back some of that cognitive complexity a little bit. Okay, and then when it comes to scoring, so these are known issues again in scoring responses, but this specifically relates to summary writing as well. And so these are ideas. So we reviewed not only the CFR, but we reviewed academic literature around summary writing as well, of which there is quite a lot, to be honest. So the extent to which they've included main versus supporting ideas, assistance for assessors. We mentioned that. I'll talk about that in a moment. Evaluating synthesis. So, for example, have the test takers simply summarized ideas from text 1 and summarized ideas from text 2? Or to what extent have they integrated the two? So every single version of this task that we have designed has been written so that the task can be integrated. So the two texts are not unrelated. An interesting decision that we made was to actually have the two texts generally supportive of each other. So the obvious road to go down would have been to have two texts that actually contradicted or differed from each other in some fundamental way. And potentially that's quite good from a critical reading point of view. But from a kind of synthesis point of view, it makes it a little bit more difficult, because what you end up with is lots and lots of test taker responses saying something like, well, text A says X, whereas text B says Y. And that isn't ideal, to be honest. So we wanted to find a way to get around that. And the best way we came up with was to actually have almost like supportive, the text being supportive of each other a little bit more to encourage this synthesis. And also evaluating paraphrasing and differentiating between source use and owned language. And then, of course, when it comes to an analytic rating scale, the extent to which this actually, is able to encompass the meaning and the content of the two texts as well. So we had to write that very carefully. And again, this is something that is publicly available, so I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but this is actually what the rating scale looks like for this task. So it is aligned to the Common European Framework. We do include the kind of plus level within the rating scale, but we don't necessarily include the plus level descriptors. Instead, to be awarded a kind of plus level, you've got to meet the majority of the descriptors within each band, more specifically, and then people at the lower band within each, or lower CFR level within each band, they are the sort of minimally meeting those descriptors. So we do. The other thing to notice is that we don't specifically incorporate reading as a separate element. It's actually incorporated throughout here. So the usage and accuracy is mostly contained within task fulfillment, but you will also find it within the second column as well, which is kind of organization. So it's using appropriate ideas, organizing them logically, the extent to which they flow, the extent to which they've been accurately represented, and whether or not they have been sufficiently synthesized so that a reader can identify the main ideas without recourse to the original input text as well. The other thing to say about this is, although we have grammar and lexis, because the response is limited to only 100 words, what we couldn't really do is to write descriptors that get at grammatical complexity or even range of lexis, because it's simply not a long enough response for you to get at complex grammatical points, particularly when students are writing from input materials. So instead, the descriptors are written to talk about control. Grammatical control and lexical control are far more important, and the extent to which they have been able to adapt input material as well. So again, I do highlight some of these ideas, but I'm not going to dwell on that. But the next thing to mention is how to assist the assessors in relation to this. So what we also have is for every single task that we generate in relation to this, we also generate what we call task-specific marking guidelines as well. So that looks like the table on the left. So what we have is the main ideas and the supporting details very explicitly laid out for the assessor. And then whether the idea comes from paragraph 2 or paragraph 1, or the textbook extract or the lecture transcript. So we can see where the main ideas come from. We can see where the supporting ideas come from. And the other thing to highlight is the fact that we have not standardized where the ideas come from. So a risk with a task like this is that you always have the main ideas at the beginning of text 1 and the beginning of text 2, so that the test takers become test wise and they learn the kind of strategy underpinning your task design. So if they just think, well, all I need to do is read the first sentence from paragraph 1 and the first sentence from paragraph 2. Okay, there's my main ideas, and I can just supplement that with a little bit of information from text 1, a little bit of information from text 2, and job done. So what we've done is we've mixed up the order of information in the text so that the main ideas are sort of not buried, but they are still sort of not necessarily within the introductory sentences for each text. And they may all be located within one text, and then some supporting information, some supplementary information is located within text 2 or 1. So there's no standardized approach to this. And then we also provide a guideline for the use of the marking criteria as well, where we actually provide operational definitions of redraft, synthesis, redundancy, coherence, and cohesion. And then final words before we just go into our discussion about this as well, which is how we go about validating any of this. So if we want to say, okay, this is what we've designed, this is what we've implemented, what evidence do we produce to show this actually works, this thing? And I think this might be important for you guys as well. If, for example, you find yourself in a situation where you have to justify your assessment design, either to test takers or to other stakeholders, such as administrators or lecturers. So some things to think about are assessor reliability, alignment or correlation with other tasks. So for example, if you've got a task like this and you've got more traditional tasks like an essay task, for example, to what extent do they correlate? Or do you find that test takers underperform in, say, your integrated or mediation task in relation to your more traditional tasks, which could be a source of invalidity to look out for? You could do some product focus or process oriented research. So get some feedback from the test takers themselves about what they did during the task versus what they actually produced during the task. So some actual text-based analysis of their output. And then compare their output against, say, CFR descriptors. So again, these are interesting approaches to validity as well. And I know you've undergone. I know you've seen quite a few AI-related roadshows recently. So I didn't really want today to be about AI, but it's worth considering how AI can actually help you with, with mediation style tasks, because they can potentially. Can they write good input text? Can they write good summaries? So we have actually played around with AI in relation to our summary task. We've actually fed a couple of our summary tasks to ChatGPT and asked it to write a summary. And unfortunately, it does a very good job. I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing right now, but it does a good job. It does actually create a summary very close to what we were expecting as a kind of C1 level response. It can do that. And it even synthesizes. It does actually combine information from both texts pretty well. The main thing that I think we're excited about is the ability to score responses, actually. The research that we've done so far is suggesting that it's actually potentially quite useful for this. And I mean, this is actually a piece of research that we've done based on the pilot test that shows the relationship between the summary task and an essay task. So as you'd expect, there's the proportion of shared variance was around about 60%, but the reliability was equal. It was just as strong for the summary task as the essay, which we were genuinely quite surprised about. So test takers did provide evidence that they were able to do this. And then there was some feedback from them as well, in terms of the extent to which they agreed this was relevant for university, this is finding it difficult, clear instructions, enough time. And around about 75% of the participants from the pilot suggested that they were pretty happy with this approach to the test. I won't dwell on this because I think this is something that don't quite have time to do, but I will show you this. So what we did also do was some analysis looking at how test takers used the input language here. And what we found that was really interesting was the use of strings of text input from both the string input from text 1 and text 2 actually. So you can develop a little bit of a computer program, which we did, to look at the proportion of language from text 1, the proportion of language from text 2, and the proportion of original language that the test takers introduced. And the extent to which they used strings, so multi-word pieces of input from text 1 and text 2 in their responses. And it was really quite interesting. And so we found that, generally speaking, roundabout they split into thirds. So 1/3 was maybe from the text versus 1/3 was kind of their own language. But when you break it down a little bit more, if you look at that, when we look at CFR levels as well, we found that there was an increase in original language at B2 and C1 compared to B1. And there was, an interesting distinction between C1 and B2 that started to emerge as well in terms of how the language was being used. So actually, for example, if you look at C1 at the bottom there, C1 used very, very few instances of what we call trigrams. So 3-word strings from text 1 and text 2 did not occur very much in C1 level responses when compared to B2 and B1 level responses. So this was a relatively small sample. There's only 66 responses, but I'm currently working on replicating this research with about 1,000 responses to see if it holds, and to use that as the basis for potentially automating an approach to assessment. So just to sort of finish off, and then let's see what people think about any of this. So what we do think is that at the moment, based on research that we've done, is that these kinds of tasks, mediation tasks, are definitely capable of eliciting responses across the CFR, but are particularly good at B2 and C1. We do have evidence that they are good for getting at these real-world activities, and that students generally agree that that is the case. But going back to what we said about the timing earlier, test takers are unfamiliar with this type of task. So they need a lot of support and a lot of input in terms of helping them familiarize themselves with what they're expected to do, both in terms of the output and the strategies as well. And that they're only really capable of performing to the best of their ability to actually showcase what they can do once they've had sufficient practice and sufficient familiarity, because even high-level test takers will suffer with this task type if they're not familiar with them. And I think that's the kind of key takeaway from what we've found out so far based on our own investigations with this. So great. I think that's all I want to talk about at the moment, but I am happy to have a few minutes, comments, questions, thoughts about any of this, just in the final couple of minutes that we have.